Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I am your host, Graham Culbertson, and my guest today is Luke Kemp. Luke has been on the show a number of times, discussing the work of David Graeber and James C. Scott, and then his own book, Goliath's Curse: The History and Future of Societal Collapse. Luke and I already recorded an episode about this book, but we only got to the first of 3 parts, so we agreed to record 2 more parts. This is the second part of the book. It's called Imperial March and Fall. And if you haven't read the book or listened to that first episode, it essentially takes James C. Scott's anarchist squint, this reading of history from below what states and empires and violence and domination and coercion have actually meant for, well, all humans, as much as Luke is able to take the book all the way back into prehistory. When we get into the episode, Luke and I had a list of questions, and he said he wanted to get to one of the last ones that I had just said we probably weren't going to get to. So then we just jump right into that question, and then we do an introduction. So after the music by David Hill, you'll get thrown right into that. And after you listen, you can look forward to Luke returning to the podcast one more time later this year to finally finish out the book. I'm here to talk to Luke Kemp, and I'll record a little introduction to this about Goliath's Curse. And we're going to talk about, before we get to everything else, this question of the states and states versus empire. So I don't know if you remember this, Luke, but I was chatting with you at one point about my theory that there's no such thing as a monarchy. And this comes from kind of a joke where Tolkien says he wants to live in either anarchy or an unconstitutional monarchy. And people have taken, like Graeber has written, like, well, these things have in common is there's no bureaucracy. And so if you have an unconstitutional monarch, because a constitutional monarch is a monarch who is restrained by the form of government, because constitution just means, form of government. Doesn't mean a written document. We Americans think constitution means a written document because we have one, but not everyone has one. It just means form of government. So, but I think Tolkien's joke is more subtle than that, because if you have an unconstitutional monarch, the monarch actually has no levers of power. If you're an unconstitutional monarch, that means you have no army. In fact, I declare myself right now, I, Graham Culbertson, am monarch of planet Earth. You know what that makes me? That makes me an unconstitutional monarch. I'm a governor without a government. And if you don't have a government, it turns out you're not the king of anything. So you need at least 2 people to have authority. You can't have a monarchy of one. So there's no such thing as a monarchy. All systems of government are this overlapping set of relationships between multiple people. And at least to have a true monarchy, you need at least 3 people. The guy to give the orders, the guy with the sword, and the third person to take commands from the guy with the sword after they have been delivered by the monarch. This is what government is essentially a constitutional relationship in which commands are issued by someone, carried out by someone else against someone else. How does that sound so far?
That sounds about right. And notably, most of the definitions we have of states and sovereignty and statehood usually rely upon some notion of coercion. The very famous one from Weber being the legitimate monopoly on the means of violence. And there's 2 key things here. One is legitimate. And this has always become problematic because it depends who defines legitimacy. And of course, most, essentially wannabe kings throughout history have always said they have legitimate control on the means of violence. It's actually pretty rare that any state has a complete monopoly per se. That's, as far as I know, I don't think any state's ever had completely that. Even Australia has been very successful in terms of gun reform. There's still some people who have guns. Like, it's just impossible not to completely ensure that. But the key things are essentially a marriage between violence and legitimacy. And I would say this is the basis to almost every form of government to a large extent. And one of the key things is that over history, they've become better and better at making it seem more legitimate, whether that be democracies or autocracies, that matter.
Excellent. So this legitimacy thing gets perfectly to this question that we were talking about in your book, that every state is an empire. So we're supposed to believe, if we're anti-imperial, which we were supposed to be anti-imperial until a few months ago. Empires were supposed to be bad, and Putin had empires, but we in the enlightened West just, sometimes extend a helping hand to other governments. But Donald Trump has given up on the idea. I mean, as far as I know, and I'm already off topic again, this war in Iran is the first example I can think of an American imperial conflict. I mean, literally, that I can think of in the entire time that wasn't extended under the guise of liberalism, of like, we are helping people. It started off, oh, we're helping the Iranian people for about 1 minute, and now it's just like, we we do what we want and we take what we want because we're American. It's like, he doesn't know he's supposed to say it's about democracy. He doesn't know he's supposed to say that every person we murder is a little bit closer to a freer world. I guess he doesn't care. I guess.
No, I don't think so.
So with that said, to get back to where we are, so empires are when a group of people in some sort of central way, some sort of in group, controls territories that in some other way is not their territory, and they have taken it by force. So the Roman Empire, it's from Rome, but they rule what we would now call Spain. So that's an empire. Whereas a regular nice state is just a place that has some sort of government where all the people in some ways consent to this government, and they're not being ruled from afar. There's not some central other that rules them. A state can be nice and it can be democratic and it has the monopoly on power, but it's not this, those people over there control us. We control ourselves. We're all on team the state. And this is supposed to be better than an empire. And you argue in your book that this distinction actually doesn't exist. It's a fig leaf, that states are empires, empires are states. There's always a them ruling and an us being ruled, and there's no way around it. Have I got that
Precisely.
correct? Yeah.
More or less. So the definition that most people tend to coalesce around when it comes to empire is something along the lines of one polity having political control or domination over another polity. And that can be formal, that can be the annexation and conquest of one land, and you install a puppet ruler, or you become the de facto ruler of new conquered territory. Or it could be the control of resources, so the other essentially becomes, in practice or formally, a vassal state. When we think about this, it really hinges upon this idea of you have to have one state, something recognized as a state, conquering something else recognized as a state. But there's no really big important reason as to why you're conquering another state, right? Like the US was essentially one group of colonists conquering huge swathes of indigenous peoples. And that resulted in essentially the world's largest state, or the most powerful state, I should say. But there's really an interesting question as to like, why would we draw a really clear line here between you have to be conquering another sovereign entity, particularly because the actual amount of power or land they have could be enormous, even if they are not a state, technically speaking. Ultimately, what this is about is one group dominating and politically controlling another group. And when you look at what are often called complex hunter-gatherers, what I prefer to call hierarchical hunter-gatherers, people like the Calusa, for instance, they essentially are one group of armed people dominating another through violence and essentially taking tribute from them. And this is something which marks all the way from hierarchical hunter-gatherers through to CDC states to the very largest empires we think of. There's a spectrum here in terms of how large they go, how bureaucratic they are, etc., but they all rely upon the same logic of violence. And this helps to solve a whole bunch of problems we've had when discussing empires, because when people talk about empires, they get confused very easily. Think, for instance, of the Roman Empire. Before reaching the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic had expanded roughly 1,000-fold across the entirety of Eurasia. It had done so through violence. It had taken over numerous different, both pre-existing indigenous peoples, city-states, and states, and yet somehow it wasn't an empire until eventually Caesar, not Augustus, gets into power. That's stupid. That's not an empire. All you're talking there is a difference between republic and military dictatorship. And even there, there's some arguments that Augustus was actually more politically inclusive than the preceding arrangements were. But Rome had been an empire for a very long period of time before then. Likewise, there's big discussions of, was the UK and was Britain an empire when it started colonizing its neighbors, or when it went overseas and started taking over other territories? And most people often talk about it being an empire once it starts going overseas, but they've already conquered Scotland, Wales. You've already basically had internal colonization within England itself. All the way down, it's just simply one group violently dominating and extracting resources from a larger periphery. And suddenly, all the states today are essentially either the inheritors of empires or are pretty much empires themselves. And even the ones we tend to recognize as being nation states, Germany is the outcome of Prussian aggression and striving for an empire. Likewise, China, its borders are more or less just the Qin Empire expanding outwards continuously. And we forget that the United States has what it, until recently, still referred to as colonies in places like Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii. They're all still essentially empires. We don't live with the United Nations. It should be called the United Empires of the world.
Yeah, and I want to stress. So if you look at something like Athens, so when Athens becomes a democracy, one of the first things it does is become more imperial.
Yeah.
But even when Athens is a democracy and just a city state before it has started, basically conquering and exacting tribute, just like the mafia, because governments are just organized crime, you have women and slaves. And if you ask them, is the Athenian government an imperial government? They're very unlikely to say, no, because I wasn't part of a polity that was conquered by another polity. They're likely to say, yes, there's those people over there, those armed Athenian men who make the decisions, and then I'm over here and I have to do what they say. That's an
Exactly.
empire.
Yeah.
That's what a state is an empire.
Yeah. I think the reason we've avoided having clearer terminology like this and recognize that empire is more a spectrum from, you can say, kind of more brutal to less brutal, larger to smaller,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a spectrum and one that essentially encompasses all states, is because empire's usually been a dirty word. Most people today don't like the term empire, imperialism, Star Wars, it's very clear who the bad guys are. They are the empire. And I think that's the reason why we still are very, very hesitant to realize this kind of heritage and reality that all states are empires. And even if you want to make it, well, if it's sufficiently inclusive and legitimate, it's no longer an empire. There's very few of the states around the world which actually think past that mark. Maybe Switzerland, maybe, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah. So the good news is we don't have to say that empire is a dirty word when we're looking at these. So when we're looking at these older things, basically empire
Yeah,
becomes a dirty word in the early 20th century.
precisely.
So George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the architect of Washington D.C., they agree the goal of the United States is what they call a republican empire, and they're not shy about that. John Ruskin, who is a radical in so many ways, is a famous defender of empire. Even Edith Wharton in the early 20th century defends the French empire. So actually, if you want to say like, oh well, the United States didn't begin as an empire; it was just a nice little state. Well, you've got George Washington right there saying we're an empire, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
So let's take them at their word
yeah.
that they were that they made an empire.
Exactly. It's similarly, even during World War II, the US is pretty clear it had colonies.
Yeah,
It was a colonizing power. It was not fighting for the freedom of all of its citizens necessarily. It was pretty happy to be a colonial power. And this is also true, of course, of Britain.
yeah, yep. And we now post 45 or 48 or wherever you want to say, we're supposed to be uncomfortable with being empires, so we just have these things. I mean, anyone who knows anything about the history of Puerto Rico knows that the United States still has, I'm sorry, it's not a colony, it's a territory, I believe,
Territory.
which
Yeah.
territory literally means a place that exists.
Yep.
So okay, now that we've done the last bullet point that we said we probably wouldn't get to, and now we've gotten to it, at Luke Kemp's request, which is good. I mean, I always want to talk about the things that you haven't talked about over and over again. Nope, I'm not quite done with it. I mean, I would just say that the problem with this is with people not having an anarchist enough view of the world. If you start off that there's a certain kind of state that is bad, and there's other kind of states that are essentially good, then it's going to be very important to you to be able to explain what the good kind of state is. I see this also, and I've brought this up a few times. I'm a little nervous every time I do, but I'll do it again. I see this also with discussions of slavery. There's a very strong left wing tradition of using terms like wage slavery, and Emma Goldman says that wives are slaves. But people want to be able to say that there was this thing called slavery. It was worse than everything else, and it's very easy to say that the experience of Africans in the 15th through early 20th century and the kind of slavery they lived under was worse than pretty much any other form of slavery we know of. But then it gets tricky because people want to say, well, Emma Goldman can't say women are slaves because slavery is the worst thing and it happened to Africans in the Americas. And it's like, well, if you're willing to just be against hierarchical forms of violence and you're willing to name hierarchical forms of violence at an individual level that deprive people of their freedoms of slavery, then you're going to see slavery everywhere and it becomes a continuum, precisely
Yep.
as you've described with empires and states.
Precisely. One of the problems I had when writing the book is you have to do so much revisionist history around the terms we use.
Yeah.
And obviously, I've done it when it comes to civilization and Goliath. Civilization is always supposed to be a nice term to define a state of social arrangements and affairs that is desirable and is a good thing that it happened. And similarly, as we've talked about, empires are supposed to be by and large a bad thing, but luckily a historical relic that we no longer have. And occasionally, someone will still be imperialist, and they're heading towards being the bad guy, but they usually stop eventually.
Yeah.
But so much of this is essentially a inheritance propaganda. There's certain terms which have been handed down with very strong connotations, where we draw some pretty arbitrary lines, but we don't recognize and we often forget that these things are often on a spectrum of, if you will, badness. And it's pretty clear here when it comes to slavery. As you've mentioned, there were big discussions around wage slavery, particularly after the abolition of slavery, where many African Americans who were no longer slaves were put in conditions where they often had less care and worse pay, going out and being free men, if you will. They didn't feel like they were free necessarily. They still had to essentially go and work for white people in order to get their money and actually survive, and were often being cared for far, far less than they were on better plantations, for instance. That's, of course, not in any way to
Yeah.
justify the actual institution of slavery, but to say that they weren't always in better conditions thereafter. But unfortunately, this is something we have to deal with. And even the term anarchism, we have the same problem. People think of throwing a brick for a window. They don't actually think of the ideals of people like Bakunin and Kropotkin.
Yeah, and this, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. For a lot of people, the sharecropping system, which really I'm quite happy to call as a form of debt slavery,
Yeah.
was worse. The problem that we're confronting. Well, one is the fact that we want to have this liberal Whiggish view of history that slavery was a relic of the past and
Yeah.
we're over it now. But two, the other problem is, and this is a real problem, and I think we're okay since we're on a podcast and we're talking and we're taking time and using nuance, but this is a problem if you're on Twitter, is that this thing that you just said, you know, we can this is a absolutely virulent, awful, right-wing statement. We can summarize your statement as like, actually, things were better for Black people in America under slavery. This is a thing that people actually say on the
Yeah.
internet. And when they say it because they are the worst, most racist people on the internet. And
Yeah.
finding the place where you can say, well, actually, in some ways, that horrible thing that that super racist person said on Twitter is true, but let's go through all of the ways that it's complicated. And that's hard to do, and especially for me as a classroom teacher. It's like, okay, I have 50 minutes. How can I explain to the students how bad sharecropping was for Black people while knowing that I'm going to say sentences that sound like John C. Calhoun? And it's hard. It's incredibly hard. And if you've got people who have accepted that slavery was bad, but now it went away and that was good, then it's tricky. You also don't want to do the opposite thing of suggesting that things haven't improved, because for many people, in many ways, things have improved, and that's another real downer that you get from anarchists and left people in general, is the inability to acknowledge the various ways that things are better now.
Exactly.
So many
Yeah.
things are so much worse than they were 200 years ago for so many people, and a lot of things are a lot better for many people
Yeah,
than they were 200
absolutely.
years ago. It's just tricky.
I think there's a big difference between saying the abolition of slavery was resulted in a whole bunch of people being worse off because slavery is actually a good institution, which, let's face it, is absolutely stupid, and there's no grounds for saying that whatsoever.
No.
And very, very different is saying the abolition of slavery resulted in some people being worse off because, unfortunately, the conditions they found themselves in were not as appealing as the ones they had under, as you mentioned, sharecrop plantations. That's quite different. It's still obviously very unintuitive, but it has a fairly good amount of historical evidence to support it. And it's important to still note, as you mentioned, the advances here, like simply saying that one person cannot legally own another person is an enormous step forward. But ultimately, it's an enormous step forward because you want those people to have political recognition, to have voice, and to, of course, be treated better, to have economic freedom, and basically be able to live in a fairly free, open, and, well, just simply survive fashion. And that was a step forward, but it's worthwhile remembering they did not get the vote until a substantial amount of time later.
Yeah, and this, I guess one last thing that I shouldn't mention, but I will. The only way for them to the period in which things were better for them is called radical reconstruction, and
Yeah.
radical reconstruction was a military dictatorship. I mean, that was done by force of coercion. So the defenders of radical reconstruction often find themselves defending the use of centralized military power to improve the world. And that is just a place that you don't want to be, while acknowledging that the lives of Black people in the South were better when the white people in the South were being threatened by the guns of the military. And that
Yeah.
is just, I don't like any, it's what history is. It's no fun. It's not easy to talk through, and it's frustrating. For me,
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
I
I'm
think,
frustrated anyway.
yeah. In these cases, you can also separate out there were certain policies that resulted in human flourishing and improvement of conditions. The means of achieving them weren't always particularly savory, nor ones we want to repeat. And the lesson there is not necessarily military dictatorship works, but there are certain policies that can improve the human condition, lo and behold. There's different ways of getting them. And yes, we have gotten them in much more brutal, harsh ways historically, but we don't need to do that again in the future.
Yes, I agree. So let's talk about part two of Goliath's Curse, which is
Indeed.
called Imperial March and Fall. And we ended, or we're near the end of our last discussion of Goliath's Curse, the first part, which focuses on prehistory, with you saying that your big takeaway from the study of history is that history, government is the story of organized crime. And then that's where you start off this section. I noticed when I was looking over the book, that's where it starts. So why don't you tell us a bit about section two of the book? What's in it? I mean, of course, everyone by now should have read it, but if they don't remember exactly what's in section two, you can tell them.
Section 2 essentially covers The timeline all the way from the rise of the very first states, approximately 5,000 years ago, with Uruk and the first dynasty of Egypt, through to the modern world. That's obviously a very big slice of history. Actually, less so than the first part, but people always forget that we had 300,000 years of living during the ice ages. And it covers most of the big empires you'd think of: the Han Dynasty, the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Maya, the we have a couple of different larger African empires in there as well, including the Mali and the Songhai. But essentially, it tries to take a global sweep across different world regions to see how empires rose up and fell repeatedly, and what were the similarities as well as the differences across them. And in each of these cases, I tend to zone in on a particular lesson. For instance, the late Bronze Age collapse, it's that sometimes collapse wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In the case of the Maya, I zone in a bit more on the idea that writing is often lost in collapse. And a key lesson we have here from multiple different case studies, including the Maya, is that writing is often lost because there's only a small number of people who really want to use it. It's often a small elite class, or because the conquerors often try to systematically annihilate it, which was the case of the Maya. A better case of the former of it becoming obsolete is in the case of Linear B, which was used in Mycenae. And essentially, a Linear B falls out of favor because there's only a small number of writers who actually use it. In Pylos, I think we found roughly, 16 or so potential writers of that script. Once the palaces fall apart and the writers are no longer employed by kings, there's no use for the writing system anymore, and it falls out of favor. Similarly, when it comes to the use of hieroglyphs in Egypt, it essentially falls out of favor because it is more or less confined to the religious class of priests. And once they are no longer funded and propped up by the Roman Empire, lo and behold, the script is no longer used. But in short, Section 2 is all about the rise and fall of empires across human history and the larger patterns we can see.
Okay, excellent. And let's get right in. I want to talk about the Bronze Age collapse in a second. But first, I'll say, what happened after a collapse is sometimes called a dark age. And what a dark age means is that there's less writing from this period. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It means that it is less illuminated to us historians, scholars, academics, because they didn't write stuff down. So if you had the world's most perfect society and you didn't write it down, that would be considered a dark age from a historical perspective. The other thing is, though, the dark age is supposed to be bad, there's the other sort of Renaissance sense of, the people in the Middle Ages, roughly in Europe 500 to 1500, their lives were less good. And I know people have heard on this podcast multiple times, including when the medieval historian Eleanor Janega was on the podcast, that it does seem that during those so-called dark ages where people were writing less, which makes sense because a lot of writing, writing is an elite thing. Two, a lot of writing is about taxes and laws.
Yep.
And actually, the Middle Ages were somewhat anarchic. Kropotkin makes this argument. Janega makes this argument. You have centralizing powers, and those powers don't have the bureaucracy and the armies to do what they would like to do. So you have a lot of people kind of living their lives, and they seem to have been healthier. Maybe they didn't have aqueducts anymore, but whatever food they raised, they got to eat.
Yep.
And you have extended this "the Dark Ages are good," actually, narrative to the Bronze Age collapse. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's worthwhile noting here as well that the term Dark Age comes originally from Petrarch. And essentially Petrarch is using this because he's a huge fan of ancient Rome and Greece, and he sees his current age as being this dark abyss of cultural depravity and recession compared to the light of Rome and Greece. The funny thing is that the actual script he's using is Phoenician, which actually emerges out of the late Bronze Age collapse. So the late Bronze Age collapse is an interesting one. This is when you had a collection of different states and empires across the Mediterranean. So this included many ones people are familiar with. So, for instance, the old Egyptian kingdom, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean, basically the original warlords of Greece. and a whole bunch of smaller different polities as well, including individual city states, which were mainly trading hubs like Ugrit. And what happens is essentially all of these start to fall apart at roughly the same time, albeit in different ways. Some of them mainly just go through periods of kind of political decentralization and fragmentation. In the case of Egypt, for instance, and the case of the Assyrian Empire as well, there's been at least one historian who just referred to it as something like a bad recession, which may have been a bit of an exaggeration. It was probably worse than that. But they seem to go through relatively unscathed, while others, like in the case of Greece, there's more or less what people recognize as complete collapse. We have large scale population shifts. Essentially, all of the palaces are abandoned, and you don't have any sign of governmental centralized power for centuries thereafter. What's interesting is it doesn't seem like this results in people being worse off. So, first of all, there's some evidence that people seem to grow taller after the late Bronze Age collapse. And in general, we tend to use height as being a decent biophysical indicator for overall health. If someone has lived a life full of lots of food, excess calories, a very varied diet, they've had exercise, and they haven't gone through periods of famine or disease, they're usually going to be taller. While someone who's had to endure a famine, particularly while growing up, or has had to endure a bout of disease while growing up, will usually be smaller. And understandably, if they've had less food, they'll also be smaller. And you see it pretty conclusively that across most of the late Bronze Age, people seem to get taller. And this also interestingly happens after the fall of the Western Roman Empire as well. It's something of a, I think, underexplored and still at this stage sparsely populated area, but it seems to be common across lots of collapses actually. And a lot of critics would claim, well, so many people die that naturally the survivors have more resources left for themselves, which doesn't seem to be true. If we look at, say, for instance, the case of Rome, people are actually getting shorter once the empire rises up. Well, not quite shorter. Basically, people are growing rapidly taller in the Italian peninsula until Rome arrives, and their rate of change, their rate of growth actually slows down. And what's even more interesting is people outside the empire are taller than those inside the empire. So this old trope of the muscle-bound Germanic barbarian, it's kind of true. Compared to their Italian counterparts, they actually were probably much larger and much healthier. For the late Bronze Age collapse, there's an additional interesting fact here, which is when we look at grave goods, so often when people are buried, they're buried with different kinds of goods, whether it be jewelry, weaponry, or often just household items. When we look at the Assyrian Empire, interestingly, people, particularly in rural areas, and it's worthwhile noting, most people live in rural areas. Even the height of Rome, 95% of people are essentially more or less subsistence farmers. In the rural areas of the Assyrian Empire, which has kind of less change, they actually seem to get poorer and poorer. So it wasn't good to be in the Assyrian followed by Neo-Assyrian Empire, even though it has a pretty good time post-collapse. It actually ends up becoming a much bigger military power. But in terms of grave goods, the average person seems to be increasingly worse off. And in general, even when it comes to things like cultural progress, we tend to forget that most of the kind of Greek literature we hold up, the epic poems of Homer, for instance, which may have been a collection of different authors actually, they're all essentially from an oral tradition that happened during the Dark Age of Greece. So it's not like people were culture regressing or incapable of telling really cool stories. They definitely did. They just didn't write them down. Once again, the problem of that idea of the Dark Age. But this seems to be a commonality across lots of collapses, is that it may have had some downsides. Yes, there was some initial spurts of violence, but it wasn't always apocalyptic. And it may have had a whole bunch of blessings. And in many cases, overall, it may be better for the average person.
Yeah, I think when you hear about, if you study what led the Roman Empire to collapse, one of the things that you will hear is just it seems like there were not enough Roman men. At some point,
Yep.
they just like they weren't making enough. They weren't popping out enough babies that could grow up and be soldiers to go off and kill the Germans on the northern and eastern border. And when you think about that, you think, well, I mean, it's simple. You can think about the military industrial complex that we live under today, and you think, if all of those people whose job it is to make missiles were instead making food instead of being fed by other people making food, think of how much more food we would have. Plus, they're dying in the war. It's actually pretty obvious that if your main goal with every boy who is born is to turn him into a soldier, unless he absolutely can't be spared as a farmer. And if you stop turning most young men into soldiers, you would surely expect flowering and flourishing. Now, the narrative would be, well, if you don't turn them into soldiers, the other empire is going to come in and sweep them away. But that's just like a mutually assured destruction argument. We need an empire because other empires exist. That's no good. I don't think it actually works that way. It seems that the other empires exist because you made an empire.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I point out in the book is that often we think about these as being arms races, but ultimately they're kind of symbiotic.
Yeah.
You often rely upon the bad guy over there in order to justify being a bad guy at home.
Yes.
And it's very difficult in many of the cases of original state formation to tell, were there actually external threats? Or was the original dynasty of Egypt just basically using the illusion of external threats to justify having much more militaristic practices? We see them, for instance, going from essentially having trade with Canaan to more or less turning it into tribute. And we don't know what kind of propaganda or messaging was being used to the people. Maybe they were being told, hey, those Canaanites, can't trust them. We're going to have to take them over and turn the trade into tribute. But there's no evidence they actually were in any way militaristic or a threat to Egypt. And likewise, when we look at, say, for instance, even the modern world, the case of the nuclear arms race between Russia and the US, it's not a race for the first decade or so. Essentially, during the 1950s and 60s, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the stockpile is held by the US. Russia is not that interested in nuclear weapons. It's only in the 1970s that Russia starts to massively spike up and eventually overtake the US. Hence, I think in many of these cases, it's really much more about almost a symbiosis between elite groups. And often you need one elite group elsewhere to justify having one at home. But looping this back into the case of Rome, I mean, as you mentioned, often this was they had less military or less men available for military service. And part of that was also the story of inequality, which I point towards as being one of the big driving factors behind societal collapses. So in the case of Rome, by the end of the late Roman Empire, it is incredibly grossly unequal. At least by one estimate, it's roughly 3/4 of the way towards the maximum theoretical limit on inequality. And that maximum theoretical level is essentially one where one individual holds all the excess wealth and everyone else has just enough to survive and reproduce on. And that wasn't exactly an exceptional case. One study of 28 pre-modern states found that there were, on average, 77% towards that maximum theoretical level of inequality. But either way, Rome was grossly unequal, and it also tended to vastly overtax its ordinary citizens, in particular its farmers, which meant that increasingly the farmers turned to wealthy landholders and others to essentially shield both themselves as well as their sons from getting picked up for military conscription or from having to pay taxes. And as you get that, you start to get a regionalization of the Roman military, and of course, an increasing reliance upon Germanic mercenaries. But it's difficult to tell a story without recognizing the deeper story of Rome of growing wealth inequality across its history and the increasing power of essentially wealthy landholders in relationship to the central empire. And as I point towards in the book, this is something that happens across essentially all the big case studies, including ones like the Han Dynasty, which follows a very similar timeline of rise and fall as that of Rome.
Yeah, that's excellent. Before we move to the next thing, I just briefly want to touch on this topic of symbiosis. I mean, I could hardly be more critical of the USSR and of China under Mao, but it is true, and this came up in my episode on Mao with my old professor Carl Girth. The liberal empires, which I mean, if you were gonna be the subject of an empire, you would rather have Eisenhower's America than Stalin's Russia. But it was true that the good liberal empires felt very threatened by these socialist republics, and said they were going, and in some cases sent armies to attack them. If you're wondering why the USSR spent so much of its resources, and later Mao's China spent so much of its resources on building an army with a tight hierarchical control on that army, you have to know that people like Eisenhower were assembling armies to invade that country. So that's if you want to know why those states became totalitarian, there's lots of reasons, and I do think totalitarianism is in part of Marx's vision, whether he meant it or not. But another part is, in this case, we don't have to know. We don't have to speculate. Were there outsiders with weapons threatening them? Yes, there were outsiders with weapons threatening them, and their names were the United Kingdom and the United States. We know absolutely who it is, and we know that building up a Soviet army or People's Republic of China army was a very rational response to, quote, Western imperialism.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's often easy to hide those threats behind a veil of we're the good guys and we're simply defending ourselves, or we're defending freedom, democracy, and allies.
Yeah.
It's notable that Rome expands from being a single small city-state to taking over huge swathes of Eurasia, obviously most of Europe. It was, at least in one telling, I think this is Walter Schade who mentioned that it's probably equivalent to Palo Alto, so this little basic city near Silicon, or basically Silicon Valley near San Francisco, essentially taking over the entire continental United States. And Rome does this without ever apparently undertaking a war of aggression, at least in the telling of some of its major historians like Livy. In the telling of Livy, it's basically always done either to defend an ally, or to defend itself, or to expand and improve the rule of law, justice, etc.
Yeah.
Actually, once again, Walter Schadl has this amazing slide during a presentation where there's this long bit of text talking about only one country has gone to war, not for itself, but for the self-defense of its allies and for the idea of justice, etc., etc. It's all very flowery. And he asks what country is this from? And, some people suggest the United States, as you expect. And interestingly, it's actually a blending of text from the Roman Republic and the US, but it's almost like it's just beautifully fluid. Like you don't see any difference between the text at all. And this is one of the problems, of course, is that you can make threats and you can make aggression look quite just. And this is what I think modern states do quite effectively. But it's worthwhile noting that even when there does seem to be a really clear bad guy and good guy, if you will, they're quite frequently still working together. I mean, there's some great examples here, like Israel apparently is fighting for its existence and survival in the Near East, and it has some sworn enemies, and yet it trades with them all the time and even sells very potent military technology to them. There was the NSO Group, which is technically a private company, but it had this product called Pegasus, which is a very powerful mass surveillance tool, which essentially allows you to brute force hack into a phone or laptop just by simply knowing the number or the IP address. They then sell that to the UAE. And to do the selling, they actually have to get approval from the IDF. They're selling an incredibly potent mass surveillance weapon to their ostensible hostile enemies. This happens all the time. So once again, this is much more about symbiosis than it is about arms races per se. But regardless of what the driver is, you still see a pretty clear trend across history where, whether it be the potential threat of neighbors or whether it be just simply the illusion of there being a threat, empires do essentially grow stronger and larger over time. So if we're looking between the very first states and empires across the world through to, I think it's like 500 BC or so, essentially empires don't really get much larger than roughly 1 million square kilometers, which is roughly the size of modern-day Egypt. And then you have the Achaemenid Empire and a whole bunch of much larger ones, and essentially you get ones which range up to 5 to 6 million square kilometers, in particular both Rome as well as the Han Dynasty. And then eventually you get these really big steppe empires, so Genghis Khan's empire, I think, is roughly 24 million square kilometers. And eventually you get colonial empires with, I think, the Brits clocking in at 42 million square kilometers and essentially going across every time zone of the world. So there's a really clear pattern here of empires growing substantially larger and also becoming much more internally coherent. They're evolving, if you will. I call it in the book Goliath evolution, but they still eventually collapse as well.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to say about that, and this question of evolution. I'm going to leave it aside for now, though, because I do want to ask you this question that I mentioned before. So, you mentioned in our last interview, I think it was in our last interview, that you started off, wanting a Hobbesian world hegemon who could make the world a better place, and you come out of this new field. I would say a relatively new field, studies of
Mm.
collapse. I've been, as I mentioned to you, I think I mentioned to you every time, I've been observing this field with skepticism
Yeah,
and thought
rightfully
it
so.
seemed, and it was so lovely in your book when you were very skeptical. I know we talked about this in the last interview. I think we talked about this in the last interview. I'm skeptical of all of these, somewhat silly narratives of collapse, the doomsday clock and all these predictions that civilization will end in a certain year, and the year always has a zero in it. It's never 57.2 years. It's always
I wonder
50.
why.
Yeah. Yeah, you wonder because they made these fucking numbers up and there's no intellectual truth behind it.
I
But
actually also in the book I have a table of different predictions of existential risks. So essentially, when we'll have either human extinction or global societal collapse, and they all tend to be things like 1 in 6, 1 in 3, 1 in 4. I'm like, those are awfully round numbers.
yeah. Yeah, they clear, I mean, they just made it up, which is fine,
Yeah,
but on the other hand, these people, and this is where the question comes from, these people tend to have after them titles like distinguished professor at Harvard, or
mm,
undersecretary of such and such at the UN. Worrying about collapse is a very popular thing for very serious people. And
yeah.
I wanted to ask you what it's like to be moving in these circles. I mean, I know you're at Cambridge, and be pro collapse, because if you're Larry Summers or at Davos or something, you're supposed to hate collapse, and presumably, people are gonna pick up if your book is sitting next to Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a very comforting
Mm,
narrative for this kind of people. Is there tension in your life? I mean,
mm.
what is it like to move in the imperial center while trying to write a people's history of collapse?
Yes, it's funny. I wrote the book primarily across the UK and the US. So I had a writing stint in Princeton at one stage, and then I wrote a fair chunk of it in Notre Dame, and much of it in the University of Cambridge. But most of those places are pretty close to either DC, in the case of Princeton, or close to London, which are essentially the two beating hearts of the world's most recent superpower and superpower
I want to
empires.
cut in there and say, beyond that, those places are the intellectual center. You
Yes,
will find tons of people
absolutely.
trained at Princeton in DC. So it's sort of
Yeah,
like it's their little thinking spot for the empire.
exactly. And even in the case of the UK, I forget the exact number, but it's something silly like 95% of prime ministers have come from either Oxford or Cambridge. Oxford is the winner by a pretty significant margin, but nonetheless, there definitely are tensions here, which I do notice. I mean, it's always been a bit weird for me being in these circles in general. I come from a kind of much more working class rural background than Australia. And when I went to university, I had to change my accent somewhat, coming from a rural area. And I had to do it again when I came to Cambridge as well. And most of the different traditions and rituals here, you tend to have things like high tables at the the colleges. They're kind of cool at first, but they're also become very archaic and suffocating very quickly. Or the idea that you can't walk on the grass. May be okay to many of the people who have a very different background, but for me, it just seems incredibly silly. Um, and it's pretty clear that when it comes to the book, for instance, it's never going to get an endorsement from the likes of Bill Gates, Elon Musk, etc., for very obvious reasons. There's not work in their interest. By comparison, Sapiens, it by and large takes off because it gets endorsements from Bill Gates
Yeah.
and Obama. If you actually look at the sales trajectory, it's doing pretty well. I think it's still a bestseller, but then it gets a endorsement from Gates, takes off dramatically, and then Obama, it just goes absolutely stratospheric. This is pretty clear for a lot of different books that if you essentially have the backing of a billionaire or someone whose friends are billionaires, it tends to do pretty well. And as you've mentioned, there is this weird preoccupation, not just from like the powerful elite, but often amongst other groups as well, with collapse. And it's worthwhile noting that for me, I do think collapse is a good thing historically. I think there's reasons to be more worried about certain types of collapses going forward. If we have a nuclear war, for instance, I think it's pretty bad. The way of cutting it up, it's just a terrible fucking outcome. And likewise, I think if you have a large-scale breakdown of industrial supply chains, etc., lots of people are going to die. It's going to be very, very horrible. But when I define collapse in the book, I do talk about this being a fragmentation and contraction of power structures. And strangely enough, I think that's essentially what we need to have in some way going forward. In a much more controlled, democratic fashion without all the bad things happening, without large-scale population losses, for instance. But nonetheless, you have to kind of have a collapse of power structures, if you will. Or at the very least, a reform which is so deep and structural that essentially would look like a collapse in some ways. That's something which, once again, powerful people when they talk about collapse don't like to think about. I think one of the reasons that collapse has such utility and currency amongst elites is part of what I call the authoritarian impulse in the book. We have pretty good evidence from social psychology and psychology in general, even from neurology, that when people feel threatened, they shift in their values. They tend to become more authoritarian. We even have some weird surveys suggesting that people start to prefer leaders who essentially look more masculine, are taller, etc., when they're in something more of a wartime setting. Naturally, this seems to make sense on just an anecdotal level. Putin comes to power largely on the basis of a whole bunch of bombings in Chechnya, Chechen bombings, I should say, which some people speculate that he may have had a hand in. Likewise, Netanyahu initially soars in popularity when they have the genocide in Gaza. And of course, people like Hitler more or less rise to power because they have a really strong sense of you're in danger, and here's an outsider who's to blame for this. Likewise, across the world today, we see in countries with a lot of economic precarity, the rise of the far right and democratic backsliding. But a lot of this is just this authoritarian impulse. People become more authoritarian when they feel threatened. And hence, if you want to do a power grab, it's actually a pretty good idea to say, by the way, everything's going to collapse. And usually this is based upon some pretty outlandish things like fertility, for instance, that seems to be one of the big ones, or something like migration. And it's worth noting that in the book, those don't really come up very often because there's no evidence that these play any kind of role in past societal collapses or will play one in any kind of future collapse either.
Yeah, I'm going to mention, but please don't respond to this because we can't go off on this narrative that the tax base is going to collapse because we're not having enough babies, and just like it's just so dumb.
I know. It's the weird thing is, I'm like, okay, so if we keep on having babies, it's going to be a large amount of population, and that previously was always seen as a reason for collapse because there's going to be too many people on the earth, leading to environmental degradation. I'm sure if we stagnate, that'll probably be a bad thing as well. And yet, if we also decline in fertility, that's also going to lead to collapse. Like, what the fuck can you do?
Yeah. I mean, I'm amenable to talking about ways that the world would need to change if we have population decreases. But specifically, they say the tax revenue will go down, and then we won't. And it's like, well, you do know that money is made up, right? So like, the problem, like, they never say there won't be enough people doing things. They say there won't be enough productivity for the tax base, and it's like, you do know that well, anyways, they can't know that the numbers are different from the reality because their entire life is, if you get the numbers right, the reality will follow.
Yeah, it's also just, if you have decades of forewarning that you're going to have these oncoming structural changes to the economy, you can do things to prepare for it. Technically speaking.
No. It's more babies, or the system has to remain exactly the same, and the population growth has to look exactly the same. You couldn't change the system. That would just be...
It's worth noting this actually does have a tie into the book once again, where I talk about in the book how One of the reasons that empires seem to prevail and essentially seem to kill off every other form of political organization across the world is one of the reasons is essentially population. They just tend to have way more babies and be much larger. I mean, notably Rome, it's not particularly inventive, but it has enormous amounts of military mobilization. Roughly 25% of times of the fighting age men, so basically between the ages of 17 to 40 or so, are mobilized military. You don't get those numbers again until you get the levy en mass conscription, basically, with Napoleon. That's the reason why Rome expands. It loses lots of battles, but it never loses wars because you just throw in more and more people, more and more young men into the war machine. But it's not just simply that these empires tend to be agrarian and hence they have lots of kids. There's also really big efforts by the rich and the powerful and by rulers to make people have more kids. I point towards both Augustus had, I think, tax breaks for people having larger families, for instance. The Han dynasty had very similar things. And of course, today, Hungary spends 5% of its GDP on trying to improve fertility. But this is something which is a really long-standing obsession from elites, is they want people to have more babies. I'm not entirely sure as to why. Part of me thinks it's that if you have power over people, then naturally you want there to be more people for you to have power over. And of course, if you have a larger base of people, that means more people to use for things like military, taxation, etc. But it does seem to be a very weird preoccupation, which is, I think, in part driving this massive concern people have around fertility.
It is it is a weird preoccupation. Okay, we've been talking for about an hour. Do you want to go for a little bit longer? We can wrap up here. We have agreed to do this one more time. So what do you want to do now, Luke? It's up to you. I can go either way. I am free right now, but I don't need to keep you.
No, we can go for a little bit longer. Why not?
Okay. All right. Well, then let me consult my questions and see if I want to prioritize anything. Yeah, let's talk about. We could talk for an hour about why rulers are obsessed with people having babies and why that's the collapse that they seem to fear the most. But let's not talk about that. So let's talk about Goliath, because you mentioned in the book that you don't use the word the machine, which is the word. I mean, I like the term the machine. Obviously, this thinker Lewis Mumford, who I don't know if he ever declared himself an anarchist, but was a fellow traveler with anarchists. Really liked the work of Maria Louise Berneri and praised it, who was another anarchist thinker. I mean, Mumford is I would say, like a kind of like James C. Scott, like someone who practices the anarchist squint, even if he wasn't on the barricades. And there's this new sort of like right-wing radical anarchist book by Paul Kingsnorth, which I have read part of and found very interesting, and of course found things to disagree with greatly because of the right-wing nature of it, which is, I think it's called Against the Machine.
Yeah.
And, I like this machine metaphor. You mention you like the Goliath metaphor because you want to make sure that people know that these empires are fragile and they can collapse. I think that makes sense, but we need the machine metaphor as well, because it certainly, it chews people up and spits them out. It has inputs and outputs in a way that the individual Goliath doesn't. And then I noticed in this book, you mentioned that for reasons that we don't fully know, you sort of speculate, and you sort of speculated again just now in this conversation talking about evolution. The Goliaths do seem to be getting bigger. And while they do always collapse, although we haven't seen the collapse of the most recent one, which is I would say the like post 1945 world order, people are talking that one might be collapsing right now. We'll see. We can record in 5 years if there is still an internet to see if we want to declare 2026 as the year that the collapse happened. So if it is just a Goliath and it is so fragile, how come the machine stops, as Ian Forster says, but the machine starts up again over and over and over again? China's the most obvious example.
Yeah.
Would you watch? Oh, sorry to go on, but I love kung fu movies, and especially these.
I was not expecting that.
yes, I love kung fu movies, and even more, I love the wuxia films of King Hu, but in a lot of kung fu movies and a lot of wuxia movies, there's a problem, which is that the evil Manchus are ruling the country, and they must be replaced by a true Han Chinese ruler. And watching this as an outsider, I'm just like, so you don't care that there's an emperor who can execute anyone. You really care about the bloodline of
Yeah.
that emperor. And if you look at China, China's claim is that it's an unbroken state for several thousands of years. But in fact, China has been broken lots of times,
Yep.
but it always gets put back together exactly the same way. I mean, not exactly, but almost exactly the same way. What is happening?
Oof, there's a bit to unpick here. So first of all, in terms of the
Yeah,
choice of
please give your answer in the form of a kung fu metaphor. So sorry.
Oof, I mean, I personally prefer boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I practice. I can use those, but Kung Fu, I'll be absolutely a pacifist in this case when it comes to metaphor. When it came to Goliath, the choice of the metaphor there was, I think this works for several reasons in comparison to competitors. So as you mentioned, there's both the idea of the machine as well as the mega machine. There's also more organic metaphors. So, for instance, Nate Hagens, who's a pretty big kind of talking head in the collapse space, uses the idea of the superorganism,
Mm-hmm.
while others have spoken in terms of Moloch. Moloch being a Canaanite god, where essentially people would sacrifice their children to Moloch prior to going into
Mm-hmm.
warfare in order to get some kind of competitive advantage. And weirdly, Moloch is used both as a way to talk about game theoretic traps, so things like arms races, but also talk about these things that produce these very big hierarchical domination based entities. The reason I don't like Moloch is I think that when you start to make things seem so ethereal and godlike, it also makes them seem both reified, they're natural, but also they're impossible to destroy. Killing a god, deicide, is pretty hard. I don't like the superorganism because this makes it seem far too organic and natural, and I
Mm-hmm.
just don't really think that's true per se. And the machine, I think, is much closer to the mark. And I think you're right that it actually does have a sense of people being put in as inputs, they're being churned through and spat out. And I think there's a truth to that. And I think most empires have increasingly over time tried to make themselves more bureaucratized, more efficient, more machine like, if you will. And we see that happening increasingly with AI as well, where AI is increasingly taking over decision making power. The reason I still think Goliath is superior is because, as mentioned, as you said, it's got a certain fragility, which I think is important to bear in mind. It doesn't make it seem inevitable or impossible to destroy, but also because I think it is important to keep in mind that these things are composed of people. They're composed of people making choices. And yes, there are larger structural factors. And in general, I'm something still of a historical materialist. I think the material circumstances matter immensely. But nonetheless, these are structures of domination made up of people. And I think things like individual psychology do matter. In the book, I point towards the dark angels of our nature, things like status competition, the dark triad, the authoritarian impulse, and the phenomenon of power corrupting as being pretty important in terms of understanding why we so often seem to be ruled by the worst of us. While we don't have, feminist workers' cooperatives being the original states, for instance. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, that this is a human phenomenon. And if we're going to change it, it'll have to be, of course, through people as well. Why is it that Goliaths, first of all, expand, but then also why they're always resurrected, why they always come back? In terms of the expansion, I think there actually is an explanation here. In the book, I point towards a really important paper by Bruce Trigger, a very famous archaeologist. And the paper is called A Thermodynamic Explanation of Ritualistic Behavior. He essentially puts forward that whenever you look at big ritualistic behaviors, so things like grand burials, for instance, even human sacrifice, particularly alongside burials, or building things like ziggurats, pyramids, great monuments, they all tend to be acts of conspicuous consumption. They're all essentially wastefully using energy to signal status, which makes sense. There's really nothing more powerful to say, more important than you, than by having people work their entire lives to make you a death monument. And the interesting thing is, this is in stark contrast to what we see with nomadic egalitarian hunter gatherers. they tend to be very frugal about their energy. It's often called the principle of least effort. They essentially have to conserve things because they're in a very energy scarce environment. And in general, they also tend to do this because they don't want to have a dominance hierarchy, and they also prioritize things like leisure, for instance. But in short, they don't have large amounts of conspicuous consumption. There is still some, just nowhere near as much what you see with the first states. And even today, most consumption still ends up being conspicuous, and we're all pretty aware this is often done for status competition. But I think if you're the head of an empire, if you're part of the elite class, then one of the ways to expand your power, of course, is to take over others, to get more resources, to fuel more conspicuous consumption. And even for Rome, they were pretty clear about this. This was often about for the glory of Rome. Their conquest wasn't just simply for material circumstances, it was in some way for the status of the empire and, of course, for its ruling class. So I think that ends up being one engine behind the growth, or the very least the motivation for growth in empires. In terms of why do they come back, we'll have to revisit Goliath fuel here. So for those of you who can't remember the first talk very well, Goliath fuel is a collection of 3 different things that tend to lead to the creation of a Goliath. Lootable resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored. Monopolizable weapons that are easily monopolized by a single group. And caged land, essentially land or geography with fewer exit options for people to move. When we look at states of a time and empires of a time, they tend to essentially ingrain these forms of Goliath fuel. So if you've had an empire around for a long period of time, you've probably changed most of the landscape towards agrarian fields, where it's very easy to grow things like wheat and rice. It's not so easy to rehabilitate those into good areas for hunting and gathering necessarily. And most people don't know how to easily move from being essentially either part-time farmers or full-time farmers to being primarily hunter-gatherers. On top of that, weapons like Iron Age weapons are still around. Even if you have a collapse, the weapons still exist, the monopolizable weapons are still there. And it's pretty rare that those weapons completely collapse from the empire. It does occasionally happen, but it is a rarity. And last but not least, as you have population growth over time, it also tends to decrease exit options alongside, of course, people increasingly taking up agriculture. So in short, once you start to get empires, they tend to increase the conditions that will lead to empires being created in the future, different forms of Goliath fuel. In the case of China, there's some additional factors here. One is that China is surprisingly effective at having both a really deeply ingrained bureaucracy and also a common language and script across most of the empire. That means that whenever you have the collapse of one dynasty and the take up by another dynasty, they can very easily rely upon some continuity by just basically hiring the old bureaucrats. And you even see this when China is taken over by outsiders. The Han dynasty, for instance, is basically Mongolian raiders from the steppe. They come in, they take over, but they still rely upon the Chinese bureaucracy to run things, which makes sense. If you're in a rule and you just want to have taxes and get status, then the easiest way to do that is just to basically reuse the old imperial machinery. So it's that kind of cultural and institutional continuity which allows for much quicker resurrection in the case of China. There's actually a good book I can recommend on this called Escape from Rome, where Walter Scheidel, one of my favorite historians, you can probably tell from the fact I've mentioned multiple times, he essentially talks about why was Rome different to the rest of the world, basically, insofar as Europe only ever has one lasting empire over the entire area. That's Rome. Well, in the case of the Near East, for instance, South America, or in the case of China, you essentially have large standing empires come over and over again. And to answer that question, he has to look at essentially what makes unified empires more likely to crop up, be resurrected, and stay alive.
Yeah, that I hadn't thought of it from that angle, but Rome has been a topic of this podcast all along, and I had some Roman historians on at one point who described the empire. And when they were done describing it, I said, basically, what you're describing is a confederation. And they said, well, sort of, but a confederation has to be bottom up and organic. And Rome was a top down. It was a confederation of elites of various cities. Yeah. And it makes sense that if what you've got is a confederation of elites, then you can't, to use the machine metaphor rather than the Goliath metaphor,
Mm,
you can't sit in the control center and
mm,
push the button to turn it back on, because there is no control center in that way. So that makes that Shiloh suggestion makes complete sense. And then of course it does the China thing, right? If you think, I mean, another way to think of it is to think of civilizations as computers,
mm,
that run on the operating system is bureaucracy. And
mm.
so then, yeah, you just type into your DOS, window, exe, run exe China bureaucracy, and then ta-da, there it is. As long as you've got a few soldiers around, as long as people are still used to listening to the Confucian scholars, and you can't do that in Rome. There's no centralized hierarchical operating system. There's no CPU in Rome, to continue this metaphor.
Yeah. And Rome, I think, is often better described as something like a pyramid scheme, where essentially Rome starts off as a city-state, it starts conquering its neighbors, and as it conquers them, it says, "Hey, your other neighbors, we should probably conquer those too. What,
Yeah,
you want to help us out?" And you often has things like military levies, but essentially, it's kind of almost building one really big, somewhat centralized alliance based upon that. Um, but yeah, either way, I'd definitely recommend the book. And I think there's some pretty clear answers as to why we see this resurrection phenomenon happening. And it's worthwhile noting, even the case of Rome, where you don't end up with a unified empire over the top of Europe again. Napoleon gets pretty close, but I think what the Napoleonic Empire uniting Europe only lasts for around about 7 or 10 years before it falls apart, while Rome lasts for about, 500 or so. Despite that, you still do, of course, see the resurrection of smaller scale Goliaths across Europe. And at least in Scheidler's telling, this ends up being very important because when you have all these different warring Goliaths within Europe, they start to innovate and evolve much more rapidly, particularly when it comes to gunpowder based technology and things like navigation, etc., which leads to the colonial empires, the next
right.
big expansion. Um, so even though Rome doesn't yield a similar unified empire that you see, the Qin being followed by the Han, etc., you still do see Goliaths pop up again and again and again.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would guess that their influence is certainly in other words, even if it's a patchwork of Goliaths, it doesn't cover as much land as Rome does, I
Yeah.
think, until you get to Napoleon in the modern state.
Although notably, some much larger empires, like the British Empire, for instance, they still use Rome as an exemplar,
Yeah,
as a model they're trying to follow. And essentially, every empire across Europe after Rome always talks about how they are the inheritors of Rome. In the book, I talk about the translatio imperii, which is this old Latin phrase for essentially the handing down of imperial power. That when one empire collapses or is destroyed, another empire almost always tries to take its mantle symbolically. It's the idea of the power being not lost, but being transferred across empires. And if we're going to talk about a good example of this, when you look at the collapse, if you will, of the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire, in the eyes of the Spanish, they don't actually collapse.
yeah,
If you go to the Real Palacio, the royal palace in Madrid, when you're standing at the front, there's a whole bunch of, as you'd expect, aristocratic European gentlemen, different rulers, but there's still two very differently clothed ones flanking the front doors. And it's Atahualpa and Moctezuma, the last rulers of the Incan and Aztec empires, respectively. They are there because, in the eyes of the Spanish crown, they basically take over and inherit the empires. And this nobility of both the Aztec and the Incan Empire becomes Spanish nobility under Spanish law. So we can talk about collapse, but it's important to remember the elements of consistency and continuity here as well.
yeah. Yes, I found that incredibly striking in the book. The idea that if you look at the letter they wrote for Columbus, Ferdinand and Isabella, they don't describe themselves as the monarchs of Spain. Spain doesn't exist at that time. They describe themselves as the monarchs of 20 different territories, and it makes sense that they just added two. In addition to Aragon and Castilla, just let's just add. Uh, as what is now um, South America to that.
Yeah, exactly. And since I've already said several controversial things, I'll go in and chuck in another one,
Oh,
which is it's notable that in this case, the local elites end up being complicit in their own domination. The Spanish don't have enough manpower to essentially take over the entire empire. They rely upon the existing governance system, the existing system of nobles, the existing taxation system of the empire to essentially carry it forward. Exactly the same with the Incan as well. You don't really see the much larger changes in things like language, taxation system, governance, etc., until basically centuries pass. It's a much longer term process. But to begin with, they rely upon the architecture and the skeleton of the old empires to carry it forwards. And the local elites are pretty happy to do so.
yeah, because their position is unchanged, and
Precisely.
people are much more likely to think of themselves in this hierarchical way than in the sort of democratic nation state way that we want to think of. That really, this idea of, I am French and we the French have a state, that's 19th century shit. I mean, that is so recent. The idea that we are all linked, all of us here, from the king to the lowest peasant, by
Yep.
language and culture and ties. Benedict Anderson's famous book Imagine Communities is about this. That's 200 years old. So of course those elites aren't going to be like, "Oh no, you've destroyed my Mayan heritage, and we, all of us on Team Maya, collectively together hate the." They know what they are. They know they're rulers and enslavers, and game recognized game, if I might say. Sorry, I'm sorry. So
Yeah.
we should be wrapping up. You touched on this briefly. I am curious, though, if you have any thoughts about if we are currently experiencing a collapse. I mean, I did mention, and I was kidding, but I'm serious. The United States,
Mm.
it's kind of sort of changed its Department of Defense to a Department of War, and it's currently engaging in an active imperial war. And for all of the criticism, I mean, someone was pretty mad at me because I said that I thought the United States launched the Iraq war with good intentions. I don't think it was a good idea, but I do think that many of them they were reading Fukuyama, and they thought, if we can defeat tyranny and replace it with liberalism, it will be good. Well, you've got both the collapse of that. Every president from FDR through Obama did his imperial wars in the name of liberalism. We finally
Yeah.
have a president who's doing imperial wars in the name of imperialism. And then the second thing is, he has not only broken the rules-based order, or whatever they call it, the economic hegemony of the United States, he also has strained and stressed and shut down the lifeblood of the world economy, which is oil. So I've got a collapse historian here. We're at the beginning of the next big collapse, or towards the end of a tiny little collapse blip. I don't know which. Do you have any thoughts on this before we go?
I don't think we're in the midst of a collapse yet. When you look at what we tend to think of as a collapse, it involves things like large scale either movements or losses of population. It involves things like an entire centralized hierarchy falling apart. It involves usually massive contractions of an economy as well. And when people talk about collapse today, they're really thinking about either global collapse or the collapse of the US, one of the two. I don't see either one happening right now. When we look at, say, for instance, population, it's actually still growing despite the big fears around fertility. When you're looking at economic growth, it is still going up, even in places like the United States. The world order is certainly changing, but it's also been changing for quite some time now. When we look at, say, for instance, the exit of the US from multilateralism, that was something that was happening even over and under Obama. Trump has accelerated a pre-existing trend. I'd say similarly, even the trend towards autocracy in the US. It's worthwhile noting that many of the different things Trump is using, including the exceptional far-reaching powers of ICE, they were essentially already there. The border police already had immense power, which could basically extend, 200 miles within the border. Trump didn't do that. That was a bipartisan affair across multiple different administrations. So I do see this as being part of a longer running trend. It is worth noting, however, that I opened the book by mentioning that people often don't realize when they're in a collapse, and collapses often do take a very long time to play out. I think if we are in a collapse, it's something close at the beginning of it, and this is more the initial dynamics kicking off rather than being this is actually in the midst of a collapse. I think if we were in the midst of a collapse, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Yeah, well, that's why I said we'll have to check back. If there is still an internet and we're able to have a conversation in 5 years, it will not be, oh wow, what a collapse that was, because we will know. No, I mean I don't think it's a collapse either, but it is certainly a new dynamic, and I mean this gets a little more inside politics than I want to be. But in terms of is America collapsing? It looks like you know, our liberal political systems are going to deal with, on the one hand, they're going to deal with Trump in the terms of the midterms. And on the other hand, as you say, it's not like the idea that the president can just send people to people's doors and take them away or murder whoever he wants in any other country besides the United States. Those are, Trump has intensified, but not created them. So if we end up with another Obama style president in 3 years, then that doesn't look like collapse. That looks like continuity.
Exactly. And I think it'll be continuity which simply prolongs the things that have led to Trump.
Yeah.
Growing wealth inequality, the growing elite competition and symbiosis, so what I call elite factionalism amongst a growing elite class. Those are all trends that are going to continue, unfortunately, even if you do have someone else promising change we can believe in.
Yeah, I mean, there is I guess, to give us a bit of hope, and then I'll let you have the last word. There is a rising socialist movement in the United States post Bernie Sanders. I did have an episode on the connections between Bernie and Mamdani a couple of months ago, and that would be if the change is going to come through the political system rather than through collapse and rebuilding, it's going to have to be from a socialist movement that reverses the past 80 years move away from, or at least past 60 years, from the New Deal and towards neoliberalism. We'll see.
Yeah. In short, basically, yes. I think if you're going to have any kind of genuinely democratic party getting into power, it's going to have to run on something like a populist economic platform. And when you look at it, most people want these things. But Republicans, the vast majority of Republicans, want things like universal healthcare. The problem is right now, the battle lines are being drawn around cultural issues, and often elections are being decided by cultural issues, which is just an incredibly effective divide and conquer strategy. But if you actually campaign on basic things like the cost of living crisis, for instance, people tend to have very similar economic interests. And you tend to get suddenly a large amount of bipartisan support. And you start to also cannibalize the basic foundations of MAGA and some of Trump's key voters. So if it's going to happen, it'll be from the likes of Mamdani, I think. It'll be a continuation of many ways of what Sanders has been trying to do for decades at this stage. But at the same time, I think as we can talk about the next podcast, we also need much deeper structural changes than the ones that are being offered right now.
Okay, so it sounds like you found the place to end. Let's look forward to doing this again. Anything else you'd like to say to the listener before we go?
No, I thought that was a pretty zingy coda to finish on, actually.
Nailed it.